four foundations or the four ways of establishing mindfulness.
Mm.
So it's very much embedded in this Theravada tradition of Southeast Asia.
And the primary technique is cultivating this quality of attention called mindfulness, the purpose of which is to see the three characteristics of phenomena. So maybe just
right. So the point of developing mindfulness, or the purpose it serves, is in order to see clearly in terms of the development of wisdom, seeing with more and more clarity the impermanence of everything that arises. Whatever arises is also going to pass. And in Vipassana, we begin to see this flow of impermanence on more and more microscopic levels. As the mind gets more refined, concentration stronger, we're really in the momentary flow phenomena. And as a result of that, we begin to see what is called the unsatisfying nature of phenomena, the characteristic of things being ultimately unsatisfying.
And that's what we should perhaps put a footnote there, that this term that you're translating as unsatisfying or unsatisfactory is often translated as suffering, and hence the idea that the Buddha said life is suffering.
Right.
You might just wax for a moment on that topic.
Yeah, I think that the Pali word is dukkha, and it is the central word of the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha's teachings. The truth of dukkha, the cause of it, the end of it, and the way to the end. As you mentioned, dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's not a very accurate translation, because, as we know, there are many things in life that are pleasant and enjoyable and we don't experience as suffering. The deeper meaning of the word dukkha is that things ultimately are unsatisfying or unreliable precisely because they're impermanent.
Mm.
Some of these things are pleasant, some are unpleasant, but all are equally dukkha in the sense of not capable of giving us a lasting satisfaction. In that way of understanding it, it becomes much more universal. We can begin to encompass all of our experience in this truth of dukkha, which is very related to the truth of impermanence.
Mm.
And the third characteristic, which is illuminated through Vipassana, is the selfless nature of phenomena, that this flow of experience doesn't belong to anyone. There's no self behind it to whom it's happening. That what we are is this flow of change. And so the mindfulness is really in the service of developing this wisdom. And the wisdom is in the service of liberation.
Mm.
Because when we see the three characteristics, then the mind doesn't hold on, it doesn't grasp. And in the freedom from grasping, the mind is freed.
And so when you say liberation or freedom, what is one liberated from and what is one free of?
Ultimately, what we're freeing the mind from are various afflictive emotions, which the Buddha condensed into three unwholesome roots of greed and hatred and delusion, out of which all the others come.
Right.
And that's really what we're freeing the mind from.
Right.
Freeing it from greed, freeing it from hatred, freeing it from delusion.
Okay. Well, so I guess the other term that is going to come up, perhaps we've mentioned it already, I'm raising it as a counterpoint to Vipassana practice. It's the teachings of Dzogchen in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. There's considerable similarity between Vipassana and Dzogchen in the sense that you are paying attention very closely to your experience in the present moment and not adding anything strategically to it. But the thing that's unique about Dzogchen as a path of practice is that it begins not with a technique, although it can begin with many preliminary practices that anyone can adopt, but it really only begins with an insight into the nature of awareness, into the selfless, often called non-dual nature of awareness. And this is generally precipitated by a dialogue with a Dzogchen master, a Dzogchen teacher, who really in a hands-on way guides you into having this insight into the nature of consciousness. The clearest point of contact to the Vipassana teachings is that it's essentially a facilitated insight into the selflessness of awareness. And then one's mindfulness as a practice is mindfulness simply of that experience of selflessness. And Joseph and I will talk about how I view the difference between those two paths of practice and the significance or lack thereof of that difference. But these are the terms we want to understand, and I spell this out more clearly in my book, Waking Up. If any of this gets too confusing. Let's start with my experience of doing Vipassana. So as you know, I spent several years, and at least 1 year on retreat, practicing this Burmese style of Vipassana in a very pure way. We hadn't discovered Dzogchen teaching yet, and I didn't really have another model of how to practice. As many people do in the practice of mindfulness, I started, as virtually everyone does, with the possible exception of yourself, I started with a very clear sense of being a self, being a subject who is now adopting this practice for reasons of both intellectual interest and wanting to overcome the kinds of suffering that all selves are prone to. So I felt like I was the subject of my experience, and now I'm given this practice, which, as you gave us about an hour ago, starts with just strategically paying attention to all of one's sensory experience. So you start with the breath and the sensations of the body, and the goal is to pay attention clearly enough so as to have certain kinds of insights. One most interesting insight that is advertised is to discover that the self is an illusion, that you don't have this self that you thought you had. And with that comes a kind of relief from all the problems selves are compared to. But the issue is that you can seem to practice mindfulness as a strategy, as a self, paying strategic attention to experience, and in many cases go for weeks and months and years only in a very haphazard way experiencing this loss of self. Frankly, it seems to me that can happen even if one has had this, or seems to have had this zero experience, where you've gone all the way through the progress of insight, the lights go out, you come back, you no longer have a view of self, say, you no longer have a belief in self, but one's mindfulness thereafter is not necessarily synonymous with feeling free of self. With the Dzogchen teaching, it begins with not a practice, it begins with this insight into the selflessness of consciousness. And unless you can have that insight, you actually can't do the practice. There's not something to pay attention to apart from the selflessness of consciousness. And once you've had that insight, then every moment of practice is synonymous with selflessness. So my question to you is the mindfulness that most people experience, this dualistic mindfulness, this strategy of paying attention, not actually mindfulness? Is it just a way of orienting to the true mindfulness that will arise when you can actually see that in the act of seeing, there's just pure seeing, there's no seer and things seen? So yeah, that's the question. Is what most people most of the time call mindfulness not actually the real thing, just a way of getting people to hopefully discover the real thing?
Okay, this question just opens up a whole big discussion of various things. So first, to say that in the beginning of practice, whether it's Dzogchen or Vipassana, even though we use those two terms, Dzogchen and Vipassana, to describe the general orientation of practice, just as you pointed out with Dzogchen, but it's also true of Vipassana, for most people, the beginning practices are not actually doing Dzogchen or Vipassana. It's kind of either approximating Dzogchen, approximating some recognition of the nature of mind, the selfless nature, but people not necessarily actually experienced it, but they're in the vicinity. Mm-hmm. And so the practice is one of just again and again trying to come to it, and at a certain moment people have that actual realization. As you say, that's when Dzogchen really begins. In Vipassana, the beginning stages really are not Vipassana, even though that's the term we use for it. The beginning stages really are the development. It's basically a samatha, or concentration practice. It's using mindfulness to just connect and be present moment after moment, to build up a certain level of concentration Vipassana starts happening, real Vipassana starts happening when there's enough momentum of both mindfulness and concentration, so that first the practice starts happening by itself, and so there's not the sense of someone making an effort to do it. It's rolling along by itself, and the understanding in that rolling along by itself mode, the impermanence of things arising and passing is very clear.
Right.
So that's really the beginning of Vipassana. So that's just a little background to the beginning stages of both practices.
Right. Except that description of the beginning, to my ear, articulates a difference between the two paths. It's hard to reconcile.
No, that
Okay.
I'll be getting to that. I just wanted to point out that the terms we use to describe the practice Vipassana and Dzogchen,
Right.
in both cases have a preliminary.
Except in the case of Dzogchen, there's no confusion about when the practice starts. So, for instance, if you're agreeing with me about, or if you're suggesting that the true mindfulness only starts when...
Not true mindfulness, true Vipassana.
So mindfulness is the technique, Vipassana is the insight born of the technique.
Yes.
What we have is a culture of meditators now. That mindfulness is incredibly well subscribed as a method of meditation. Many people think they're practicing mindfulness / Vipassana.
No, but
in the way that it is there to be
but
practiced.
that's equating those two terms.
Which is common.
It is common, but that's an inaccurate and perhaps popular understanding, and that's why I'm making the point that you can be practicing mindfulness, and it's only at a certain stage of that it becomes Vipassana.
Yes.
Even though we use the term Vipassana.
Okay, so this gets to the heart of my question. So you're someone who has practiced mindfulness to the point of Vipassana. So you're playing the real game.
Okay.
My question about the character of one's mindfulness at that point is...
No, I want to get to that. I just wanted to set that framework of understanding the terminology.
Okay.
So, at the point where mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness actually becomes Vipassana practice, an insight practice, there is a very important stage of insight, which very interestingly, the term is similar to a Dzogchen term. And for myself, it's been an interesting exploration. Is it in some way related? Are the two experiences related or not? But in Vipassana, the stage of insight is called purification of view. And in Dzogchen, as you know, they talk a lot about the view and clarifying the view. So in the Vipassana, in this particular stage of insight, purification of view, there's enough momentum of mindfulness and concentration so that the whole process is running along by itself.
Right.
And there's the clear seeing, the clear understanding that in every moment, all that's happening is a pairwise progression of knowing an object. And that's all. There's knowing of a sight, a sound, a smell. And that it's seen very clearly that the knowing that's arising in this pairwise progression is also conditioned and impermanent.
Right.
And so there is a profound and still beginning understanding of the selfless nature of knowing, of consciousness.
Right.
And so from that, and this is not a moment, this is, at this stage,
It's a flow.
it's a flow of
Yes.
that experience. And it,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's familiar to me from my Vipassana practice. The difference, however, is that you're still talking about a way of seeing that is contingent upon momentum. It's contingent upon having built up the energy of practice on retreat so that you've got enough concentration and you can really just,
Yes.
it's effortless, as you say,
Yeah.
and you are then, in some sense, being pushed from behind by all of the work you've
Yes.
recently
Yes.
put in. What's different about the insight into selflessness born of Dzogchen practice, or which is synonymous with Dzogchen practice, is that it's not contingent upon anything.
Yeah, no.
You need no momentum. It's morning here. We just got up. I haven't had enough coffee. I've got no momentum. We're just talking. But the thing that is synonymous
Yeah.
with the insight
Yes.
that is Dzogchen practice is available in this instant.
Yes, except.
And so
Right.
my question to you is that really what mindfulness is
Right.
in your view of Vipassana?
Yes. This.
I'm going to tie you down to something.
No. This whole conversation touches on a lot of interesting questions and points. So, even though the way you describe, and I've had the same experience in the Dzogchen practice, that it's not dependent on momentum, but from my perspective, at least at the moment, the emphasis in Dzogchen is stabilizing the recognition.
Yes.
To me, I think that stabilization is really another word for momentum.
Right.
You know,
I would agree with you
Uh.
there. I think that's the way you would stabilize it is to have momentum.
Yes.
So whether they're truly synonymous or momentum,
Yes.
I mean, you need concentration and you need a continuity
Yes,
of mindfulness.
yeah.
But the crucial difference, from my point of view, is it seems having practiced both and having had experiences of Vipassana momentum and Vipassana effortlessness on retreat, I came away from that experience, and as I think many, if not most, Vipassana yogis do, feeling that absolutely clear insight into selflessness is contingent upon all of that machinery of effort and momentum that one can only have on retreat. So unless you've had enough concentration over the course of a day and have been meditating for hours and hours, there's not a hell of a lot to notice in your workaday mindfulness that is truly profound or truly synonymous with the mind of enlightenment.
well, I just have some questions about that from two sides. From the Dzogchen side, even though the recognition is available in any moment, without the stability which comes from a momentum,
Right.
my experience, both in doing the practice and in observing people, is that likewise the moments of recognition are quite few and far between because of the habit of mind
Right.
of being distracted.
Yeah.
And so even though it's always available in the moment, in fact, to manifest that understanding takes momentum. Also, it takes the build-up.
Well, it depends on what you mean by manifest, because if you mean manifest the outward signs of a totally transformed personality
No,
that is
no.
attractive to others.
No,
Okay,
that's not what I mean.
So then the question is, what counts as a breakthrough into the wisdom of emptiness or the wisdom of selflessness that makes a difference to the person? What is?
I would say how often. So from the Dzogchen perspective, how often one is recognizing it.
Yes. But let's say in both cases it's mindfulness. In both cases it's noticing you've been lost in thought, and then what you then notice subsequent to noticing the thought disappear. So what can you do? This is true of every type of meditation practice. You're either lost in thought or you're noticing what you should be noticing. And in mantra practice, you're supposed to be noticing the sound of your mantra. In visualization practice, you're supposed to be noticing the thing you're visualizing. In loving kindness practice, you're supposed to be in that moment reasserting the well-wishing to your object of metta and feeling the feeling of loving kindness. In mindfulness practice, it seems to, I would guess, 99% of yogis, it certainly seemed to me for a very long time, that the alternative to the unenlightened, for the unenlightened yogi, is to notice phenomenon. There's nothing to notice but the evidence of your own unenlightenment in that moment.
Yeah,
You're noticing.
No, wait.
I'm going to let you redeem your path of practice and your life's work in a moment. But just let me fully disparage it. The difference is with Dzogchen, the only thing you're supposed to notice, and the thing which is the true taste of your mindfulness at that moment, is that there is no self-center to whatever the experience happens to be, and two, that the experience, no matter how painful, really, I mean, it could be an experience of nausea, it could be an experience of anger, whatever it is, does not change consciousness. And so consciousness actually isn't harmed by whatever crappy experience you were just having dualistically a moment ago before you were mindful. The moment you actually pay attention, there's just consciousness and the energy of this expression. And therefore, in that moment, anger and joy are equalized. And so the suffering component, to which mindfulness would be a remedy, is also canceled. So there's no one to suffer, and there's, in fact, in some sense, no suffering. It's not to say that the unpleasant sensation has to disappear in that moment, but it doesn't count in the same way it did a moment ago. So my question to you is, and you can take as long as you want trying to hem and haw and get to the answer, is that really what mindfulness just is? And most people take a very long time to discover it.
What you just described in terms of the equalizing of experience through the Dzogchen recognition, you could have been describing the function of mindfulness. Because, for example, when one is mindful of anything unpleasant, whether it's an unpleasant emotion, an unpleasant physical sensation, in that moment, the mind is not affected and is not reactive. It is in that place of simple awareness of that. And so that in the way you described it, I could have been describing the experience of mindfulness of those conditions.
Well, let's just stay on this point. This is a very important point. So it is true to say, from your perspective, that if you are being mindful of sadness, say, and in that moment sadness is still a problem, that's not
Correct.
mindfulness. And so mindfulness contains its own equanimity. You have to, if you're going to spend 2 seconds of truly being mindful, those are going to be 2 seconds of relief from the suffering.
Absolutely.
Okay, now that's I think that's poorly understood, and there are many people who practice mindfulness and are not aware of that internal standard where it's the relief may be eventual. They may feel a little bit better, but there's a subtle corruption that they're practicing mindfulness in order to change the experience, to get rid of the sadness.
Then it's not. That's what I call. I mean, I talk a lot about this in the teaching. I call that in order to mind. Right. When we're watching or being with something in order for something to happen, in order to make it go away, in order to have it strengthen or whatever. The in order to mind is not mindfulness. Right. That's just a kind of grasping, and it's desire and aversion. So as long as there's desire and aversion in the mind relative to the experience, it's not mindfulness. Your description, I resonated completely with that as mindfulness.
Except the crucial feature of my description and my experience is that the non-dual side of it is magic.
So
piece.
I want to get to this. So this I haven't expressed this before in this particular way, so we'll see how it comes out.
Okay.
One of the things that's not emphasized a lot in Vipassana, although I'm beginning to more and more because it's actually in the teachings, but in the way it's been taught, it hasn't been emphasized. In those times when one is experiencing the impermanence or the dukkha, the unsatisfying nature, or the selflessness, we can be emphasizing two different aspects of it. We can be emphasizing the seeing of the impermanence, that things are arising and passing, and so that's still object-oriented,
Right.
or the selflessness of it.
Selflessness of the flow of phenomena.
Yeah, of the flow of phenomena, including consciousness, but the phenomena will be more predominant.
Right.
It's very interesting, and I've been working with this more and more now. It's equally possible to pay attention to the nature or the quality of the mind at those times when it's seeing impermanence. And there's a teaching in the Pali text. It's in seeing impermanence, the mind doesn't cling. When it doesn't cling, it's expressed in a few different ways. In seeing impermanence, the mind becomes disenchanted. Becomes disenchanted from the grasping. In the disenchantment, it becomes dispassionate. In the dispassion, it lets go. In the letting go, there's freedom. So in that sequence, it starts with the awareness of the objects being impermanent, but it turns the attention back to the quality of the mind as it's seeing the impermanence. And that's not emphasized so much, or hasn't been.
But I'm not even hearing it emphasized in the litany you just gave, and this has always been a gripe of mine, that the anatta, the selflessness that one realizes in Vipassana, has always seemed to me to be by virtue of anicca, impermanence. So that it's because everything is changing that one extrapolates, not by thinking about it, but that one notices that there's absolutely nothing that could be self, because there's just this ungoverned flow.
Right.
But the selflessness of Dzogchen has nothing to do with impermanence. It has to do with seeing, it has to do with the felt center that was yourself drop out of consciousness. So the consciousness is free of that. So you might not be noticing change with any clarity at all, and yet there's no center.
But I think that
so
one can come to the recognition and experience of selflessness in different ways, and I don't really see that it makes any difference, because in one way or another, whether you're looking at the nature of mind itself and recognizing its selfless nature, or because all phenomena are always changing. This doesn't take a particular momentum to see. If the mind just tunes in to the changing nature that's always there, it's always present.
Right.
So that's another it's another doorway into selflessness.
This is a doorway that doesn't seem to be not only not emphasized, but not even acknowledged in the Vipassana tradition. A direct mindfulness of selflessness.
Well,
that has nothing to do with looking at it.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because for some people, their understanding, and these are people with the strong wisdom factor of mind, the selfless aspect will be what's most important. For other people, it is the impermanence that's going to be most important. The function of both is the mind that's not grasping. So that's the point of it all. And so I don't see that it matters very much which of the characteristics one sees as predominant. And so many of this, for example, with Munindraji, for example, he very much emphasized the empty nature of phenomena. You know, and I think that's why I resonated so much, because that suited my own development and experience. Sayadaw U Pandita emphasizes the dukkha aspect, which accomplished or resulted in the letting go, and not holding on. There's just one other point I wanted to get to, and I don't know if it's still in sequence enough to make the connection. One of the reasons the recognition of that selfless, empty quality of mind may not be emphasized in the Vipassana tradition as much as it is in the Dzogchen tradition, right from the beginning, is that it goes back to this notion of certain experiences uprooting the view of self. And I think for some teachers, it's that experience of having the defilements be uprooted, which is the main focus of their teaching. And so the experiences along the way, they're not necessarily emphasized because the emphasis with these teachers is to accomplish that uprooting. So they may not be pointing out all along the way, oh, look, really, really...
If continuity of mindfulness is the only tool one needs to travel the path toward these various landmarks, whether they're as significant as one thinks or not, if you're going to get practice under the model of Burmese Vipassana, you just get the mindfulness rolling along, and that's what you need to do. If mindfulness of anatta, selflessness, is just as good an object of mindfulness as any other sort of mindfulness, it's not a choice between the two paths. You could be mindful. You could recognize that there's no self very early on. Be mindful of that centerless, open nature of consciousness, and have that be your continuity of mindfulness. And presumably, that would be all you would need to have these subsequent experiences, if in fact they're there.
No, that's true. But as I said, depending on a person.
Well, let's not be so quick there. Is there any reason to think that might not be true? Is it possible in your mind that a certain style of mindfulness, and like a certain base of mindfulness, certain sensory objects as opposed to other objects, is better for having these zero experiences of cessation?
No, I think it's very individual. Depending on the particular factors which are strong in a person, one or another salient features of phenomena will be the most effective path. So for someone who is predisposed to tuning into impermanence, or tuning into dukkha, tuning into suffering, to try to force them into the anatta category, as being kind of the sole or only or best way of coming to freedom from grasping, freedom from clinging, that may not be the most effective path for them.
But see, the thing is that, in my view, the difference is, talking about the suffering and the end of suffering, the difference is so extraordinary. Which is to walk you back to part of your story that you told when you were practicing with Goenka and were doing the body scanning, and had initially had this experience of sublime body of light, no pain, and then came back and you had the body of twisted steel, and were trying to get back into the practice, and literally couldn't continue with that practice because it was so frustrating. It sounded like that was your experience. And that was 2 years fraught with the effort of trying to be mindful of a sphere of phenomenon that was just, in some sense, a condition of suffering. I mean, you could have said you were being mindful of dukkha in that situation, but you were having a very frustrated time as a yogi.
Because I wasn't being mindful.
Okay, so there's two things to say about that. One, that's not the true mindfulness.
Not at all.
You had an agenda.
Complete.
Right?
I had a strong agenda.
Right. But the fact that you had that agenda was understandable given the way the teaching was framed. In my view, you would have to.
Yes.
It's very hard not to have that agenda, and that's a liability of that style of practice. And I think that liability is there's a liability on the other side, on the Dzogchen side, which we can talk about, which we haven't talked about at all really, but the liability of the goal-oriented momentum model of get as much mindfulness as you can on whatever you can notice, is that there's a sense that you have to that freedom is elsewhere, that you're trying to schlep up to the top of the mountain and you are at the bottom, and all you can notice is the fact that you are somewhere near the bottom of the mountain.
Yeah.
And you have to keep working on this project. The difference between that and being able to just cut through to selflessness and really drop any obvious effort. I mean, that's the thing. You can be. The question is, when does it become effortless? Does it have to become effortless by virtue of momentum and the practice takes on a life of its own and you're just noticing effortlessly, or can you notice that every true instant of awareness is... I mean, this is why in Dzogchen they talk about practicing the goal as the path.
Yeah.
In my experience, that's not false advertising, because even if you're going to only get a second of mindfulness in every hour,
yeah.
There's a difference between that second obviously being the goal, or
Yeah.
that second being a strategy to reach some goal that is on the other side of this body of twisted iron.
I really don't see
The importance of
no. As you say, each tradition has, I see, its own strengths and its own potential pitfalls, and each tradition, it becomes obvious when one has practiced and fallen into the pitfalls, what they are. In the Vipassana practice, the danger is that, as I fell into, really practicing with an agenda, I think at that point I was not getting proper guidance.